She was the most famous drowning victim in the history of Hollywood, and for 40 years, the official story was that Natalie Wood simply slipped off the back of a yacht and disappeared into the Pacific. That story is dead now, because in 2018, after 6 more years of digging, the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department did something it had never done before. They stood in front of cameras and named her own husband a person of interest in her death. Not a suspect, not a killer, a person of interest, which in the careful language of law enforcement means one thing. They no longer believe the accident story either, and they are not willing to say what they think actually happened. This is not a solved case. Nobody has been charged. Nobody has been arrested. But what investigators uncovered in the years before that announcement is disturbing enough that the phrase tragic accident no longer hold together. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Natalie was not supposed to die at 43. She was, at the time of her death, one of the most bankable actresses ever come out of the studio system, a woman who had spent almost her entire life in front of a camera and had somehow, against the odds that destroy most child performers, grown into a serious and celebrated adult artist. She was born Natalia Zakharenko in San Francisco in 1938 to Russian immigrant parents, and by the age of 5 she was already working in film. Her mother, by most accounts, was a driving force behind her early career, pushing her daughter toward Hollywood with a kind of relentless conviction that left little room for Natalie to have a childhood outside the industry. That early start paid off in ways few child stars ever manage. At 17, she starred alongside James Dean in a film about restless, disaffected teenagers that became one of the defining movies of the 1950s, and her performance earned her an Academy Award nomination. From there, she built a career that most actors twice her age would have envied, moving through major studio dramas and musicals and proving, again and again, that she wasn't just a pretty face the cameras liked. She was a genuine talent, and by her early 20s she had already crossed a line that swallows so many child performers, the line between being famous and being respected. Alongside the career came a marriage that the public adored almost as much as her films. She married actor Robert Wagner in 1957, and the two of them became one of Hollywood's most photographed couples, young, glamorous, and seemingly devoted. That first marriage ended in divorce in 1962, and Natalie went on to date and marry other men, including a brief, high-profile relationship with Warren Beatty and a second marriage to producer Richard Gregson that ended after she discovered he'd been unfaithful. Then, in 1972, a full decade after their divorce, Natalie and Robert Wagner remarried, this time on a yacht off Malibu, and to the public it looked like proof that real love could survive anything. They had a daughter together, and by most accounts of people who knew them, Wagner was a present and affectionate father. That detail matters, because this story resists simple villains. People who loved Robert Wagner as a family man are not lying, and people who came to suspect him of something terrible are not necessarily lying either. Both things can sit uneasily in the same story, and that discomfort is part of why this case has never let go of the public imagination. There's one more piece of Natalie Wood's life that becomes almost impossible to ignore once you know how her story ends. Friends and biographers have long said she had a deep, specific fear of dark water, tracing back, by her own account, to a fortune teller who once warned her she would die by drowning. Whether or not you put any stock in that kind of prediction, the fear itself was reportedly very real. People who worked with her and knew her socially describe a woman who avoided swimming in open water, who grew visibly uneasy on boats at night, who kept close to shore whenever she could. It's the kind of detail that would sound like an invented plot device in a film script. In real life, it's just an eerie, well-documented fact about a woman who would eventually die in exactly the conditions she'd spent decades avoiding. Now to the weekend that ended her life. On November 27, 1981, Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davon, sailed out to Catalina Island aboard the Wagner family yacht, the Splendor. They anchored for the night, went ashore for dinner, and came back to the boat where the drinking continued. According to accounts that have surfaced over the years, including from Davon himself, the mood soured as the night went on. Walken and Wagner reportedly got into an argument, one that touched on Natalie's career and her ambitions, a subject that by multiple accounts had long been a sore spot in the marriage given the disparity between her fame and his. Wagner has acknowledged, in his own later accounts, that he smashed a wine bottle on the table during the confrontation, a detail that at minimum establishes real tension and real anger aboard that boat that night. At some point after that argument, Natalie Wood went missing. She was last seen sometime late that night, and her body was recovered the following morning, November 29th, floating in the water near the boat, wearing a nightgown, socks, and a down jacket. The initial investigation in 1981 lasted about 2 weeks and concluded that her death was an accident, that she had likely gone out onto the boat swim step to secure a dinghy that was banging against the hull in the wind, slipped, and drowned, unable to call for help loudly enough or climb back aboard in the dark and cold. For 30 years, that was essentially the entire story anyone was allowed to question in public. Here's where things start to unravel. A woman named Marilyn Wayne, who was anchored on a nearby boat that night, has said for decades that she heard a woman's voice crying out across the water, calling for help, and that she heard it for long enough to become frightened before it was answered by a man's voice, calm and unhurried, telling her something to the effect that everything was fine. She has said she reported what she heard at the time and felt for years that nobody in a position of authority took it seriously. That account alone doesn't prove anything happened beyond a drowning in progress, but it raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. If someone on a nearby boat heard cries for help, why did it take hours before the Coast Guard was formally notified that Natalie Wood was missing? The bigger break in the case came from Dennis Davon, the yacht's captain, who was aboard the entire night. In 2011, 3 decades after Wood's death, Davon went public and said that the story he originally gave investigators wasn't the full truth. He said Wagner knew Natalie was missing well before the alarm was raised, and he has described a night in which the search for her, once it began, was delayed rather than urgent. Whether every detail of Davon's account is reliable is a fair question. Witnesses recalling a chaotic, alcohol-soaked night 3 decades later are not perfect narrators, and Davon has told versions of this story that have shifted somewhat over the years. But his 2011 statements were significant enough that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case that same year, just 2 weeks before the 30th anniversary of Wood's death. That reopened investigation produced 2 developments that mattered enormously. First, in 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office formally amended Natalie Wood's death certificate. The manner of death was changed from a simple accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, a bureaucratic phrase that quietly acknowledges the original ruling no longer holds up to scrutiny. Second, investigators disclosed that the autopsy had documented bruising on Wood's body, including on her arms and legs, along with an abrasion on her cheek, injuries that one sheriff detective would later describe, on camera, as making her look like the victim of an assault. That doesn't mean she was assaulted. Bruising can come from a struggle to survive in cold water, from bumping against a boat, from any number of things. But it's not nothing, and it's part of why investigators stopped being satisfied with the old story. Then came February of 2018. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department held a press conference, saying this was likely their last real opportunity to make progress on the case given how many witnesses had already died. Lieutenant John Corina told reporters plainly that as the investigation progressed, Robert Wagner had become more of a person of interest, explaining that Wagner was established as the last person known to be with Natalie before she disappeared, and that his account of events, in Corina's words, hadn't matched up consistently with what other witnesses described. Investigators also confirmed that Wagner had declined to be re-interviewed since the case reopened. Detective Ralph Hernandez, appearing in the same interviews, said investigators could prove neither a homicide nor an accident, calling it, essentially, an open question that the physical evidence alone couldn't answer. It's worth being precise about what a person of interest designation actually means, because it gets thrown around loosely. It is not an accusation. It's an acknowledgement that someone has information or connection to a case that investigators consider significant enough to warrant further scrutiny, without rising to probable cause for an arrest. Wagner has never been charged with any crime related to Natalie Wood's death. He has denied any wrongdoing throughout, and members of his family, including Wood's own daughter Natasha, have spoken about him as a loving father figure in the years since. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire case. The man investigators can't fully clear is also, by the account of people closest to him, someone capable of real warmth and real love. Those two things existing in the same person isn't a contradiction that resolves neatly, and this story doesn't offer you one. So where does that leave things? Actually, not solved. Not even close, legally speaking. What changed in 2018 wasn't a conviction or even an arrest. It was an admission from the people investigating that the tidy story to the public was handed in 1981 doesn't survive contact with the evidence collected since. A death certificate that no longer says simple accident. A captain who says he lied the first time. A witness who says she heard cries for help that went unanswered for too long. Bruises that a detective compared, on the record, to the marks of an assault. None of it proves murder. All of it makes the word accident feel like it carrying more weight than the fact can actually support. What's genuinely unsettling about this case, more than any single piece of evidence, is how long the official version held without serious challenge, and how much of what we now know only surfaced because one witness eventually decided decades of silence wasn't worth protecting anymore. That's not unique to Natalie Wood's case. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in stories involving powerful people and inconvenient deaths. A version of events gets locked in early, gets accepted because questioning it seems paranoid or disrespectful, and it takes years, sometimes decades, before anyone with real information feels safe enough or fed up enough to say otherwise. So here's what I want to know from you. Given everything investigators have laid out, the amended death certificate, the bruising, the delayed search, the witness who says she was ignored for years, do you think this is a tragic accident made worse by a chaotic, drunken night? Or do you think there's something darker still sitting underneath the official record? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories where the official version and the real version don't quite line up, subscribe, because this won't be the last one we dig into.